Dan Shefet, I've asked you to come to the studio because I would like to, in a way, introduce you, but also to talk to you about the reason why I want to introduce you. Mm-hmm. You are a Danish lawyer in Paris. First of all, why Paris?
Well, thank you, Peter, for the opportunity to speak on your show here. Actually, I'm a French lawyer. I happen to be a Danish lawyer, but now I'm a French lawyer. And the reason why I ended up in Paris is that I was always very interested in international law, and in particular human rights, and believe it or not, in competition law. I used to work for IBM. I used to work for IBM Europe, which is based in Paris, and really work for them on the competition challenges that IBM faced back during the end of the 80s.
And
still do very much so, except that now other companies face greater challenges than IBM, but in principle it's the same legal problems. So it wasn't really planned. It was a bit of a coincidence that we ended up being in Paris.
And the reason why you are here at the Council of Europe, I will come to that in a second, but I'll introduce you in another way, because whenever I have mentioned your name to friends and whoever, then they say, oh, he's well known because he defeated Google International. What was that all about?
Well, that was indeed very, very interesting. As I mentioned, I've always been very interested in human rights and working on competition law and working in the beginning of the IT boom in the end of the 80s, drove me very quickly into the IT law as such, and seeing how you could achieve a balance between different human rights on the internet. The problem being, of course, that the internet has been unregulated from its very beginning, and that unfortunately it is completely dominated by one single human right, which is that of freedom of expression. So the consequence of that is that many people are hurt, defamed, victims of denigration, cyberbullying, harassment. There are many names, and it really creates a situation of worse than Franz Kafka could ever imagined, because the victims of such attacks on the internet, they don't know where it comes from, they don't know what to do about it, they can't delete it. The court system is completely inadequate to deal with that situation. But one thing is sure and certain, that is that it ruins their life. So if you are the victim of defamation, denigration, cyberbullying, etc., and you don't end up committing suicide, which some people unfortunately do, especially young people, unfortunately, well, you won't get a job, because all recruitment today more or less is done by Google search. The bank won't let you money. You'll get divorced. You'll lose your right to see your children. And you don't know why, because in most cases the potential employer, the bank, and so on and so forth won't even tell you why you didn't get the job, etc. Of course, they know, and they're sometimes a bit ashamed of the fact that they declined to give you a life of fulfillment and happiness just because they read something on the internet. But we live in a world today where everybody has to cover his back.
And what did you do?
So very much inspired by all of that, we had a case for a client who was defamed on the internet by an adversary in a case. In other words, we acted as this client's lawyer, which is, we did our job as lawyers, and we won the case. And unfortunately, the victim in the case started a defamation case against our client. And everybody who had anything to do with our client, it included ourselves, but included very, very influential people around the world. And it was extremely hurtful. It was extremely hurtful to the families of those involved, to their children, and to their business. People all over the world would read terrible things about you, and they would believe it, because that's the way the world works today. I mean, just think of fake news today. Which is, of course, a different problem, but it's the same problem, that you believe what you read. And so we actually took legal action against Google on the basis of the right to be forgotten case, which was a European Court of Justice case, which everybody heard about from 2014.
Was Google International or Google in Europe?
Yes, the legal action we took against Google was really the first after the right to be forgotten was confirmed as a right. I may even say as a human right. After it was confirmed by European Court of Justice that yes, you have such a right, which means to have hurtful content about you dereferenced on the internet, we took legal action in France as the first case after this case against Google France. So that would answer your question. It was not Google Inc. in the US, it was Google France. It was the local subsidiary. And the very interesting part of that is that in that case we argued that the local subsidiary was responsible and liable for the obligations of the parent. In other words, Google France was responsible for the acts and omissions and negligence of Google Inc. So that Google France could be forced and enjoined by daily penalties to dereference information which only Google Inc. could actually do. So suddenly you had one company that was forced to pay penalties until another company did something.
And what was the outcome?
And we obtained that. And we also obtained another very important jurisdictional rule, which unfortunately has not become the general rule in Europe yet, which is the so-called global reach, which means including domain names which are not just European, but also in this case .com. So if content is dereferenced or taken down on the internet, it does not only concern the .fr or .dk or .whatever which your country is, but also other countries.
I thought it was necessary to have all this background cleared up before we come to your actual visit here at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. What have you done today?
Well, thank you, Peter. Well, I'm sorry if what I just said was a bit technical,
No,
but you asked for it in a way. And it is, I must admit that from a legal point of view, it's pretty complicated. So just to summarize on this, it was indeed a very important case. It established some important legal principles. And I would say that the main legal principle it does establish is that there are other values on the internet than just free speech.
And that's why you're here.
And that is why I'm here. Now, what happened was that as a consequence of these cases, we received mails every day, and we still do, these cases were 2 years ago, from people all over the world suffering the consequences of hurtful content on the internet. Now, these are victims of defamation, denigration, so on and so forth, but they are also victims of radicalization, incitement. It becomes a societal problem and not just an individual problem that content on the internet may be hurtful. So we took the initiative, myself and some colleagues, we took the initiative to create an association in France called AID, which means the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy, AAID. This association, which I'm very pleased to preside, is an association which has now existed for a couple of years and which has a very prestigious list of board members from almost all over the world. And you may say that this association fights to introduce 3 legal principles and 3 value principles worldwide. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here. Let's say the first principle that we want to see is that the internet service providers, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, and the rest of them, are accountable for content. That is a very delicate and very complicated exercise because, of course, they're not terribly pleased with that prospect. But the general trend worldwide, except in the US, seems to be to increase accountability, mainly as a consequence of radicalization, which causes most countries to say that the internet service providers are somehow accountable for the radicalizing content that they help disseminate. So we would like to see a general principle in law detailing the conditions of such accountability. And I'll come back to that because that's why I'm here today. The second principle that AID is working on is protecting society, not just the individual, but also society. That means our democracy. That's why AID is also called Internet Democracy, AAID. Society against the harmful effects against our democracy of Well, now everybody talks about fake news, but it could be harmful effect of manipulating the electorate, of intervening in sovereign state elections. We see that happening. We saw it happening maybe in the US. And the latest I just read this morning was that now there are fears that this will happen during the presidential campaign in France. Indeed, a major problem. How do we protect our democratic processes? How do we protect the election process as such against manipulation, which, as we all know, will sway the electors?
From outside and from inside.
Both. You're absolutely right.
From the top of a society to the bottom.
I'm afraid you're right. It can come from anywhere. And what does that mean to democracy? We all know that the power of words probably wields more power than any other weapon in the world. And unfortunately, the power of words has not been restricted in any way on the internet. What will that do to our society? So first we have the values related to the protection of the individual. Then we have the values related to the protection of society, that is democracy. And the third set of values are those that relate to tolerance, stability, and essentially to world peace. We have seen how incitement can create terrible clashes of even genocidal dimensions simply on the basis of incitement. Now, what will the internet do to that? We've seen it in history too often, and that was before the internet. Now, with the internet, there is every reason to fear that it will accelerate. So these are the three areas where we need to regulate the internet. And the basis for doing that is accountability and the so-called country of origin principle, which applies to the last category, which is that a country will be responsible for the hurtful content that originates or transits on its territory vis-à-vis other countries.
Where comes the Council of Europe in that picture?
The Council of Europe, as a consequence of the development of these values and this analysis by the Association 8, we were actually called upon myself to write a report for UNESCO on internet and radicalization for a conference that took place on November 1st in Quebec last year. And we made some policy recommendations for this UNESCO conference, the first one being a content qualification assessment. That was immediately picked up by a French senator, Nathalie Goulet, when we returned to Paris from Quebec, who said, why don't we help her draft a law, which would be the first in the world, that would create such a content qualification assessment by way of creating an institution which we call the Internet Ombudsman. So what we did was we drafted this law, which was actually published in the Journal Officiel in France of November 25th. And there was a debate at the French Senate on this. We had participants from civil society, from Google, Facebook, and the others, from the judiciary, from researchers of psychology and so on. Extremely interesting to see that there was a real need to regulate online content because it leads to offline behavior. Then what happened was that another senator in France, who was also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly here in the Council of Europe, was very interested in bringing this French initiative, which was taken from the UNESCO report, to the Council of Europe level.
The defender of human rights.
Absolutely. The defender of human rights on the internet. There are many more human rights than freedom of speech, and we want to see them all on the internet, just like we have them in the real world. So we drafted a so-called motion for recommendation for the member of parliament who's French, but is a member of parliament of the Council of Europe.
And there you need signatures.
And we obtained the signatures. I'm glad to say the very, very, very fresh news is I just came down from the Secretariat, and they confirmed that we have obtained the necessary signatures, which is in excess of 20, covering 9 countries. As you know, the minimum is 5 countries. So yes, indeed, the motion has passed, so to speak. It goes further in the process. I don't know exactly what will happen tomorrow and after tomorrow. What I understand is that it will go probably to a committee with the designation of a rapporteur, but I'm afraid that will not take place tomorrow, after tomorrow. But I believe it will take place at the next session in March. So what we hope to see is that this proposal, which came from a UNESCO report, which is based on AIDS values, and was then later distilled into a bill at the French Senate, will become a Council of Europe recommendation and will inspire other countries to create an Internet Ombudsman institution in each of their jurisdictions.
May I end up this conversation by asking you, how will the person using the internet, Facebook or whatever, could be in a position where this idea can be of help?
Yeah, but you're very right. Let's be practical. Very, 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 very often, we have to give the private sector, the Googles and the rest of them, credit when they're right, and they are right that sometimes it's extremely difficult to make the judgment call as to whether certain content is illicit. Does it have the potential of hurting people? Maybe radicalizing or otherwise, defamatory and so on, and or is it okay in a democratic society to say what you say because it creates debate, and freedom of expression is very important. So how do we help the Googles and the rest of them to make that judgment call? If we make them accountable for the content that they disseminate, and they, in good faith, confronted with a specific piece of content, don't know whether it is illegal or not illegal, they need to have someone who can help them, guide them. So let's take the specific example. You see something on the internet which you feel has a potential of radicalizing or is defamatory. Maybe it's against yourself, somebody you know, or just that you happen to come across it. And you will then be able to send a notice to the search engine, which is typically Google. It could be anybody else, just Facebook. I mean, it's not really important. It's just the fact that you will be able to send it to the entity that has posted it, that has given you access, saying, I call your attention to this content. I believe for the following reasons that you should take it down. Now, in most cases, since you are a reasonable person, it will probably be true that there is some unacceptable dimension to whatever the content in question is.
Whether they involve me personally or in general.
Absolutely. There will, of course, be completely frivolous complaints, but that's the way life is. I mean, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate. On the contrary, I would say. So, again, taking you as a perfectly serious man, you would then call Google's, let's stay with Google as an example, attention to this content, and they would then say, in many cases, it would be obvious to them that it was illicit, and they would then take it down. In some cases, it would not be obvious to them, and that's where we have the problem of freedom of speech. That's where we face the concern that if we put accountability on Google and the rest of them, that maybe they'll take down everything just because you complain, which means that there'll be a lot of collateral damage on free speech because they don't want to be accountable, so they'll take it down. We don't want that. Accountability for us is not the opposite of freedom of speech. Actually, we want to promote freedom of speech in its essential version and with its essential values, which is empowerment and inclusiveness, and not division and intolerance. So, when you have one of these internet service providers from good faith does not know and does not want to take it down because that would harm freedom of speech, we need, as government, to put at their disposal an institution which is almost judicial, which is independent, very, very professional, maybe a data privacy agency or something like that, which will help them make the judgment call, which will say, we have now looked at the complaint from Peter von Kohl, and we believe that actually, yes, what Peter von Kohl has pointed out here should be taken down. And that does not violate freedom of speech.
I think you made your point clear now, but we have a world with different cultures.
Yes.
We have a world with different build-up of so-called or real democracies. There are certain persons who believe they are right whatsoever happens in their country. How to make sure that even if they have an ombudsperson, these persons are handling out of the setups you are describing now.
It's unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, it is true that the cultural diversity is a fact, and sometimes there are cultures that we find less sympathetic than others, and but since this is a European initiative, let's start with the countries that have signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights. That's a basic federating cultural phenomenon. All the countries that have signed up to the European Convention of Human Rights and have subjected themselves to the authority of the Court of Human Rights share values. If you look at the value of freedom of speech in that convention and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the famous Article 19, you will see that there are explicit provisions that say that when a right is abused, it is not protected. That's in both the UN, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European. The abuse of a right is not protected. So abusing free speech is not protected speech. There is no contradiction in that. It is explicitly said in the treaty. So the real cultural problem is that some countries may draw the line differently than others. It's not a difference of quality, it's a difference of quantity. Because all these countries agree on the values and the rights, but they draw the line differently. There may be certain countries that don't accept free speech at all as a human right. And there we will have a problem. But again, for the European environment, we all have the different values that we agree on. So the Internet Ombudsman who will operate within those jurisdictions will be subject to the treaty, to the Convention of European Human Rights. And that is the common denominator.